If you enjoy uncovering the hidden histories of the Cold War, please take a quick moment to subscribe to the channel. It helps us bring these declassified files to light. On the morning of May 14, 1959, a convoy of heavy tractors known as swing trains ground to a halt in the middle of the Greenland ice sheet. They were 150 miles inland from the coast, sitting on a plateau of ice that was thousands of feet thick. To the naked eye, there was nothing there. It was a landscape of absolute, blinding whiteness, a place where the horizon vanished into a seamless blend of snow and sky. The temperature was 30 degrees below zero. The wind, which never really stopped blowing in this part of the world, howled across the flat expanse, kicking up spindrift that stung exposed skin like sand. The man leading the expedition was Captain James Valenti of the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers. He stepped out of the lead vehicle, a massive, treaded snowcat, and adjusted his goggles. Valenti was 34 years old, a veteran of the Korean conflict, and a man who understood structure and stability better than almost anyone in the service. He looked out at the desolation and checked his compass. There were no landmarks. There were no trees, no rocks, no signs of life. Just the ice. This was the site. Valenti wasn't there to build a weather station or a temporary outpost. He was there to oversee the construction of something that had never been attempted in human history. The Pentagon had given it the code name Camp Century, but in the briefing rooms back in Washington, they called it something else. They called it the city under the ice. The concept sounded like science fiction because, in many ways, it was. The United States Army was planning to burrow into the glacier, carving out a network of tunnels and trenches. Inside those trenches, they would build a fully functioning town capable of housing 200 soldiers and scientists year-round. It would have hot showers, a library, a cinema, a hobby shop, and a hospital. And powering it all, buried deep within the frozen heart of the glacier, would be a portable nuclear reactor. The official story, the one released to the press and shown in cheerful newsreels, was that Camp Century was a research facility. It was a place to test polar construction techniques and study the climate, and while that was true, it wasn't the whole truth. It wasn't even half of it. Valenti knew the reality. The Cold War was entering a dangerous new phase. The Soviet Union had launched Sputnik 2 years earlier. The missile gap was the obsession of every general in the Pentagon. The United States needed a way to strike back if the Soviets launched a first strike, and they needed that capability to be hidden, mobile, and indestructible. The ice wasn't just a research station, it was a prototype. If Valenti and his men could prove that a nuclear-powered base could survive inside the glacier, it would pave the way for something much larger. A network of 600 nuclear missiles, constantly moving on subterranean rail cars beneath the ice sheet, invisible to Soviet spy planes and immune to attack. They called that plan Project Iceworm. But standing there in the wind, watching his men struggle to unload the survey gear, Valenti felt a distinct unease. He was an engineer, not a politician. He looked at the snow beneath his boots. It looked solid. It looked permanent. But Valenti knew something the generals in Washington chose to ignore. Ice is not rock. Ice is a fluid. It moves. It flows. It breathes. And they were about to try to tame it. The construction of Camp Century was a feat of brute force engineering. It began not with shovels, but with massive, Swiss-made snow millers. These machines, originally designed to clear alpine passes, looked like giant locomotives with rotary blades on the front. They chewed through the compacted snow, throwing massive arcs of white powder high into the air. For 3 months, the crews worked in 24-hour shifts. In the summer of 1959, the sun never set over Greenland, circling the horizon in a perpetual twilight that wreaked havoc on the men's circadian rhythms. They cut profound trenches into the ice cap. The main trench, which would become the camp's main street, was over 1,000 feet long, 26 feet wide, and nearly 30 feet deep. Valenti watched as the camp began to take shape. It was a strange, inverted skyscraper. Once the trenches were cut, the men laid corrugated steel arches over the top, creating a roof. Then, they covered the steel with snow. Within days, the snow hardened into a shell as strong as concrete. The result was a series of long buried tunnels, completely invisible from the surface. Inside these tunnels, the engineers built prefabricated wooden buildings. They were essentially large plywood boxes, insulated against the cold, raised slightly off the ice floor to prevent the heat of the buildings from melting the foundation. There was a mess hall, a chapel, barracks, and laboratories. By October 1959, the camp was operational. Stepping inside was a surreal experience. You would walk down a ramp cut into the snow, pass through a heavy steel blast door, and suddenly, you were out of the wind. The air inside the tunnels was still and quiet, hovering around 20 degrees. But inside the wooden buildings, it was a comfortable 70 degrees. Valenti walked down Main Street one evening in November. The tunnel was lit by strings of incandescent bulbs, casting long shadows against the frosted steel arches overhead. The floor of the tunnel was hard-packed snow that crunched under his boots. He passed the barber shop where a young private from Iowa was getting a trim. He passed the post exchange where men were buying cigarettes and magazines. It looked like a small American town, stripped of its sky and buried in a freezer. But there was a tension in the air that no amount of amenities could mask. The men were isolated. The nearest civilization was Thule Air Base, 150 miles of treacherous ice away. If something went wrong here, there was no quick rescue. They were living inside a hostile organism. Valenti stopped at the end of the main tunnel, where the construction of the reactor bay was underway. This was the centerpiece of the operation. Hauling diesel fuel across the ice cap to run generators was a logistical nightmare. It was too heavy, too expensive, and too vulnerable to weather. The Army's solution was the PM-2A. The PM-2A was the first portable nuclear power plant in history. It had been built in the States, disassembled into packages that could fit into a cargo plane, flown to Greenland, and dragged across the ice on sleds. Now, Valenti's men were reassembling it deep in the glacier. He watched the crews maneuvering the heavy lead shielding into place. The reactor vessel was small, shockingly small for the power it contained. It was a testament to American ingenuity, a masterpiece of the atomic age. But as Valenti ran his hand along the cold steel of the tunnel wall, he noticed something. The steel arch, installed only 4 months ago, looked different. It wasn't perfectly round anymore. It was slightly flattened at the top. The sides were bulging inward, just a fraction of an inch. Valenti pulled a notebook from his pocket and made a note. The pressure was building. The weight of the glacier overhead was pushing down, and the walls of the ice trench were pushing in. The camp wasn't just sitting in the ice, it was being squeezed by it. The day the reactor went critical, nuclear parlance for sustaining a stable chain reaction, was a day of celebration. It was late 1960. The PM-2A reactor hummed to life, and for the first time, the lights of Camp Century were powered not by the chugging, smoky diesel generators, but by the splitting of the atom. The reactor produced 2 megawatts of power. It provided electricity for the lights, the equipment, and the massive heaters needed to keep the buildings warm. But its most critical function was water. In the middle of the largest reservoir of fresh water on Earth, getting a drink was incredibly difficult. You had to melt the ice, and melting ice takes an enormous amount of energy. With the reactor online, they created a water well. They directed steam deep into the ice floor, melting a bell-shaped cavern hundreds of feet down. Pumps drew the fresh water up to the surface. It was the purest water anyone had ever tasted, frozen tens of thousands of years before the Industrial Revolution, before pollution, before the wars of men. For the crew, the reactor was a source of pride, but also a source of low-level anxiety. The reactor control room was staffed by elite technicians, men who had trained for years in the emerging field of nuclear physics. They were the priests of this underground temple, monitoring the gauges, checking the radiation levels, ensuring the beast stayed asleep. Valenti spent a lot of time in the reactor containment tunnel. He wasn't a nuclear physicist. His concern was the structure holding the reactor. The Army had dug a massive cavern for the PM-2A, much larger than the others, reinforcing it with extra steel. But the heat generated by the plant created a unique problem. Heat and ice do not mix. The engineers had installed elaborate cooling systems to keep the heat of the reactor from melting the walls of the tunnel it sat in. It was a delicate thermal balancing act. If the tunnel got too warm, the roof would drip, and the structural integrity would fail. If it got too cold, the equipment would freeze and shatter. One evening, Valenti was having coffee with the base commander, a stern colonel named Henderson. Henderson was a true believer in the mission. He saw Camp Century as the future of warfare, the ultimate high ground. "It's working, Jim," Henderson said, gesturing around the warm mess hall. "We've beaten the elements. We're living where no man was meant to live." Valenti swirled his coffee. "We're living here," he corrected. "But we haven't beaten anything. We're just holding it back." "You worry too much," Henderson laughed. "The ice is stable. The surveys said so." "The surveys were based on surface readings," Valenti said quietly. "Down here it's different. I measured Trench 14 yesterday. The walls have moved inward 3 inches in the last month. The floor is rising." Henderson frowned. "The floor?" "Viscoelastic flow," Valenti explained. "The weight of the buildings is pushing down, and the ice on the sides is squeezing up. It's like pressing your thumb into dough. The dough rises around your thumb. The camp is slowly being swallowed, Colonel." Henderson dismissed it with a wave of his hand. "So we shave the walls. We get the chainsaws out and trim the ice back. It's maintenance, Jim, nothing more." Valenti didn't argue, but he knew that trimming the ice was a temporary fix. You could cut the ice back, but you couldn't stop the millions of tons of pressure driving it. The Glacier wanted its space back, and sitting right in the middle of that slow-motion collision was a nuclear reactor filled with highly enriched uranium. By 1961, the novelty of the city under the ice had worn off. The reality of living in a hole in the ground set in. The soldiers called it the tube. Life became a series of monotonous routines. Wake up, check the equipment, chip the ice, eat, sleep. The psychological toll was subtle at first. Men became irritable. They stared a little too long at the blank walls. The complete lack of natural light, combined with the sterile, recycled air, created a sensory deprivation that gnawed at the mind. They called it the Greenland stare. But for Valenti, the primary enemy remained the geology. His predictions were proving correct, and they were happening faster than his worst-case scenarios. The tunnels were deforming. The neat symmetrical arches of 1959 were becoming twisted and warped. In the reactor tunnel, the situation was critical. The heat from the plant, despite the insulation, was softening the surrounding fern, the compacted snow that made up the tunnel walls. The massive steel beams supporting the roof began to buckle. The maintenance crews were working around the clock. Every day, teams of men with chainsaws and picks went into the crawl spaces between the buildings and the tunnel walls. They sawed away tons of encroaching ice, hauling it out on sleds. It was a Sisyphean task. No sooner had they cleared a foot of clearance than the wall would creep forward again. In the barracks, the floor began to tilt. Men would wake up in the middle of the night to the sound of wood snapping, the sound of their dormitory twisting as the foundation beneath it shifted unevenly. Doors stopped closing, windows cracked. The camp was alive and it was groaning. Valenti filed report after report to Washington. He used terms like accelerated deformation and structural compromise. He requested more steel, more heavy equipment, and eventually he requested a discussion about an exit strategy. The response from Washington was silence, or rather, new orders. They didn't want to hear about closing the camp. They wanted to expand it. It was during this period of high tension that Valenti was summoned to a secure briefing room. Colonel Henderson was there, along with 2 men in civilian suits who had arrived on the last supply flight. They didn't introduce themselves. "Captain Valenti," one of the civilians said, "your reports on the ice deformation are concerning, but they suggest a lack of vision." "It's not a lack of vision," Valenti replied, his patience wearing thin. "It's physics. The glacier moves. We built a static structure inside a dynamic medium. It's going to fail." "It cannot fail," the civilian said. He placed a file on the table. It was stamped top secret, no foreign. Camp Century is a proof of concept, but the objective is not just habitation. Valenti opened the file. Inside were blueprints he had never seen before. They showed a vast network of tunnels, hundreds of miles of them, spreading out like a spiderweb beneath the ice sheet. And inside the tunnels were trains, and on the trains were missiles, Minuteman ICBMs. "Project Iceworm," the civilian said. "We intend to deploy 600 missiles beneath the Greenland ice. The Soviets have no defense against this." They can't target what they can't see, and they can't destroy a base that is constantly moving. Valenti felt a chill that had nothing to do with the temperature. The audacity of it was staggering, but the engineering reality was terrifying. "You can't do it," Valenti said flatly. "Excuse me, Captain?" "If you build tunnels that long," Valenti said, pointing at the map, "the ice will crush them faster than you can maintain them. We can barely keep 1,000 feet of tunnel open here with a full crew working 24/7. You're talking about hundreds of miles. The rails will warp. The missiles will be misaligned. You'll have nuclear warheads derailing inside a glacier." The room went silent. The civilian looked at Colonel Henderson. Henderson looked at the floor. "We have to make it work, Jim," Henderson said softly. "The alternatives are unacceptable." The turning point came in the winter of 1962. The world was holding its breath over Cuba. The threat of nuclear war felt immediate and real. At Camp Century, the crew was on high alert. If the missiles flew, they were a prime target. The Soviets likely knew something was happening in Greenland, even if they didn't know the specifics of Project Iceworm. But the immediate threat wasn't a Soviet bomber, it was the reactor. It started with a tremor. The ice sheet, usually silent in its movement, occasionally settled with a violent crack, like a rifle shot. At 300 hours, a massive shift occurred near the reactor tunnel. The alarm klaxons blared through the icy corridors. "Radiation alert," the voice over the PA system announced. "Sector 4, seal the doors." Valenti was out of his bunk and into his boots in seconds. He grabbed his Geiger counter and ran toward the reactor bay. The air smelled of ozone and fear. Soldiers were scrambling to get into their protective gear. When Valenti reached the control room, the lead technician, a lieutenant named Miller, was pale. "What happened?" Valenti demanded. "The roof," Miller stammered. A section of the ice roof sheared off. It hit the steam line. Valenti looked through the thick lead glass window into the reactor bay. It was a chaotic scene. A massive block of ice weighing perhaps 5 tons had detached from the ceiling. It had crashed down onto the secondary coolant loop. Steam was hissing violently into the bay, filling the room with a radioactive fog. "Is the core compromised?" Valenti asked. "Negative," Miller said. "Core integrity is holding, but the steam leak is raising the temperature in the bay. If it gets too hot, the ice walls will melt faster. We could have a tunnel collapse right on top of the reactor vessel. If the tunnel collapsed, it would bury the PM-2A. It could crush the control rods, preventing them from shutting the reactor down. It could lead to a meltdown. A meltdown inside a glacier. The radioactive slag would melt its way down through the ice, eventually reaching the bedrock and the groundwater, poisoning the North Atlantic for generations. "Shut it down," Valenti ordered. "Sir, the colonel ordered us to maintain power," Miller said. "If we shut down, we lose heat. The camp freezes in 4 hours. If you don't shut it down, we'll be buried under 1,000,000 tons of ice," Valenti shouted. "Scram the reactor now." He didn't wait for Miller. Valenti hit the emergency override. The alarms changed pitch. Inside the core, the control rod slammed home, absorbing the neutrons and killing the reaction. The hum of the generator died. The lights flickered and went out, replaced by the dim, red glow of the emergency battery lighting. The silence that followed was heavy. The only sound was the hissing of the steam and the creaking of the ice. Valenti grabbed a thermal suit. "I'm going in," he said. "We have to patch that steam line and shore up the roof before we can turn the power back on." For the next 12 hours, Valenti and a team of volunteers worked inside the radioactive mist. They were freezing and sweating at the same time. They used hydraulic jacks to lift the fallen ice block off the pipes. They welded the rupture shut by the light of flashlights. All the while, the ceiling groaned above them, threatening to drop another block. They managed to fix the leak. They restarted the reactor just as the temperature in the barracks dropped to 0, but the damage was done. The incident proved that the environment was too unstable for nuclear operations. The dream of Project Iceworm, the dream of the invincible missile base, was cracking. The aftermath of the steam leak changed the atmosphere at Camp Century. The illusion of safety was gone. The men looked at the ceiling differently now. Every creak, every pop of the ice made heads snap up. Winter in Greenland is a darkness that feels physical. For months, the sun does not rise. The wind screams constantly, burying the surface markers in snowdrifts 20 feet deep. Inside the camp, the isolation deepened. Valenti noticed the decline in the men. The discipline was fraying. There were fistfights in the mess hall over trivial things. A spilled salt shaker, a wrong look. The chaplain was the busiest man on the base, but Valenti's war was with the data. He spent his nights in the small engineering office, poring over the measurements. The numbers were irrefutable. The deformation of the tunnels was accelerating. The heat from the camp and the sewage sumps was spreading through the ice, altering its viscosity. The camp was essentially digging its own grave. The heat they generated to survive was causing the ice to flow faster to crush them. He wrote a final, definitive report. He didn't send it through Colonel Henderson this time. He used a back channel, sending it directly to the Chief of Engineers in Washington via the supply plane's mail pouch. In the report, he laid out the impossible math of Camp Century. He calculated the rate of closure versus the man-hours required to cut the ice back. By his projection, within 2 years, the maintenance required to keep the tunnels open would exceed the total labor force of the camp. They would be doing nothing but cutting ice, with no time for research, no time for sleep, no time for missiles. He concluded with a stark recommendation. Project Iceworm is not feasible. Camp Century must be evacuated within 24 months, or it will be crushed with the reactor inside. Washington was slow to respond, but the geological reality didn't wait for bureaucracy. In the spring of 1963, the sewage sump failed. The cavern they had melted to hold the camp's waste began to deform, threatening to spill raw sewage into the water supply. Then, the reactor tunnel shifted again, throwing the turbine shaft out of alignment. The vibrations shook the entire complex. The city under the ice was dying. The decision, when it finally came down in 1963, was political as much as it was practical. The tensions of the Cold War had shifted. Intercontinental ballistic missiles, ICBMs, based in silos in North Dakota and on submarines, were proving to be more reliable and less expensive than the nightmare of maintaining tunnels in a glacier. Project Iceworm was quietly canceled, but canceling the project was one thing, getting out was another. The order to decommission Camp Century arrived on Valenti's desk in the summer. It was a bittersweet victory. He had been right, but being right meant dismantling the most ambitious engineering project of his generation. "We pull the reactor first," Valenti told his team. "That's the priority." Removing a nuclear reactor from a collapsing tunnel was a nightmare scenario. The PM-2A had been running for years. The components were highly radioactive. They couldn't just dismantle it with wrenches. They had to use remote manipulators and shielding. And they had to do it while the tunnel was actively closing in. The clearance in the reactor bay was now down to inches. The overhead crane, essential for lifting the reactor vessel, was jammed against the ice ceiling. "We have to cut the roof," Valenti ordered. Again. For 3 weeks, the chainsaw crews worked above the reactor. It was terrifying work. One slip, one falling chunk of ice could breach the containment vessel during the extraction. They cut away tons of ice, freeing the crane. Then came the extraction. The fuel rods were pulled first, placed in heavy lead coffins, and winched up to the surface. Then the pressure vessel. It was slow, agonizing work. The wind on the surface was gusting to 60 miles per hour, making the loading of the heavy sleds dangerous. Valenti watched as the heart of the city was ripped out. Without the reactor, the hum that had defined life at Camp Century died. The lights went out, replaced by the roar of backup diesel generators. The silence of the atomic age was replaced by the noise of the industrial age. By 1966, the evacuation was nearly complete. The camp was a ghost town. The prefabricated buildings were stripped of anything valuable. The scientific equipment was packed up. The soldiers were flown out in groups, happy to leave the ice, happy to see the sun, happy to walk on solid ground. Valenti was one of the last to leave. He walked through the deserted tunnels one last time. The deformation was shocking now. Without the constant maintenance of the chainsaw crews, the ice was reclaiming its territory with a vengeance. The walls of the mess hall were bowed in so far they were touching the tables. The roof of the main trench was sagging, the steel arches twisted like pretzels. Frost had coated everything in a thick layer of rime. It looked like the ruins of an ancient civilization, aged 1,000 years in just a few. But there was a problem, a dirty secret that the army decided to leave behind. They couldn't take everything. It was too expensive, too difficult. The reactor vessel and the fuel were gone, yes. But the low-level radioactive waste, the cooling water, the thousands of gallons of diesel fuel, the sewage, the PCBs used in the paint and the insulation. The logic in Washington was simple. The glacier is forever. They believed that the snow would continue to accumulate, burying the camp deeper and deeper. The waste would be entombed in the ice for eternity, frozen and safe. They called it burial in perpetuity. Valenti stood in the dark tunnel, looking at the abandoned barracks. He knew the ice was moving. He knew it flowed toward the coast. He estimated it would take thousands of years for this spot to reach the sea. By then, surely the waste would be inert, or future generations would have the technology to deal with it. He locked the heavy blast door of the main portal for the last time. He climbed the ramp to the surface, where the wind was whipping the snow into a frenzy. The heavy swing tractor was waiting. Valenti climbed aboard, looking back at the entrance. Within a few storms, the snow would cover the door. Within a year, the vents would be crushed. Camp Century would disappear from the map. Decades passed. The Cold War ended. The Soviet Union collapsed. The files on Camp Century gathered dust in the archives of the Pentagon. The men who served there grew old and died. Valenti retired, carrying the memory of the white desert and the hum of the reactor in his dreams. But the ice did not forget. The assumption that the glacier was a permanent tomb turned out to be the final, fatal miscalculation. The engineers of 1959 had not anticipated a warming world. They hadn't planned for climate change. In the 21st century, satellites began to notice changes in the Greenland ice sheet. The ice wasn't just accumulating, it was melting. The surface level was dropping. The meltwater was percolating down. Scientists began to run models. They looked at the coordinates of the old camp. They looked at the rate of melt. And they realized that the city under the ice was not going to stay buried forever. The waste, the diesel, the PCBs, the radioactive coolant, was still there, preserved in the dark. As the ice thinned, the pressure changed. The crushed ruins of the camp were moving closer to the surface. In 2016, a study was published that made headlines around the world. It warned that within decades, the toxic legacy of Camp Century could be exposed to the environment. If the melt continued, the waste would flush into the ocean, poisoning the marine ecosystem that local communities relied on. It was a voice from the past, a ghost of the Cold War rising to haunt the present. The story of Camp Century wasn't over. It was a ticking time bomb, set by men who thought they could conquer nature, only to find that nature plays the long game. I imagine Valenti, in his final years, watching the news reports about the melting ice. I imagine him thinking about the hubris of it all. The belief that we could build a city in a glacier, that we could hide nuclear missiles in the ice, that we could leave our garbage behind and expect the planet to keep our secrets. The story of Camp Century is a story of human ingenuity, yes. The engineering was brilliant. The bravery of the men who lived in the dark was real, but it is also a cautionary tale. We built a nuclear reactor inside a glacier because we were afraid of an enemy across the ocean. We didn't realize that the real force we should have respected was the ice itself. Chapter 12. Epilogue. Today, the site of Camp Century is just a patch of snow, indistinguishable from the thousands of miles of whiteness around it. But 50 feet down, the crushed skeletons of the buildings are still there. The twisted steel arches are still there, and the waste is still there. It waits in the silence and the cold, a monument to a time when we thought we could outsmart the earth. But the ice is moving, the clock is ticking, and eventually everything that is buried comes to light. This was the story of the city under the ice. If you found this story compelling, please like the video and share it. It helps the channel grow. And let us know in the comments. What other secret Cold War project should we uncover next? Until next time.